Hey, if we haven't met before, my name is Brian. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm going to put it out there right away. I have the head and chest cold thing that's been going around. And so if I'm like really nasally sounding, like that's why, okay? Also, I got my water up here, which like when you're sick, you're supposed to drink a lot of water. But when you drink a lot of water, you got to go pee all the time. So that's also a thing. But that's where we're at this morning. So that's where we're starting. So TMI, I know. That probably is a little bit TMI, sorry. Welcome to Bridgewood. We're so glad you're here. Gosh. Unbelievable. Hey, so as we what we're going to talk about today, like one of the things that I've recognized about like faith in Jesus is that faith is meant to be practical. Like on the most basic level, following Jesus, faith in Jesus is meant to be practical. But the problem with that oftentimes is that for most of us, we either want faith without practical or we want practical without faith. And the problem is that neither of those actually works. You see, when you want practical without faith, right? You want all the practical stuff, you want to do all the right stuff, but without faith in Jesus, it's about just trying to fix your behavior. Right, and that's what all those like self-help books are about. And a lot of the research around these self-help books is that, for the most part, they're really not that helpful. But the opposite is also a problem: faith without practical. You see, when we live with faith without making it practical, what tends to happen after a while is we start to just believe that we're good without doing good, and that's not good. You see, this is what I love so much, like, is what is so compelling to me about Jesus, is that he constantly is marrying faith with practical. He's constantly bringing these two things together to show us that when you choose to follow him, it always comes out in practical kinds of ways. It's why here at Bridgewood, why we are obsessed with asking these two questions. Jesus, what do you want to say to me? Right? Having faith that he's actually going to respond, right? And then Jesus, how do you want me to respond? What's the practical thing from this, right? And sometimes it's an action, sometimes it's a mindset shift, right? But there's always a response. It's faith and practical coming together. This morning we are going to actually wrap up a 4-month series that we have been going through on connection. The idea of seeing, hearing, and valuing others. That this is how we connect with one another. And here's the deal, if you're new with us here, you've missed the last 4 months or you've missed some of the last 4 months, don't worry. Today is still going to be incredibly helpful for you as well. But we've spent 4 months talking about connection, what the Lord has to say to us about what it means to connect with him, with each other, and with ourselves. We've spent 4 months asking this question, right? Lord, Jesus, what do you want to say to me about connection? And throughout the series, we've periodically reached into that second question, now how do you want me to respond? But today we're going to focus almost exclusively on that second question. How do you want me to respond? Now that we've heard and know up here a lot of what the Lord invites us into when it comes to connection, it's time to make it practical. Lord, how do you want me to respond? And in order to do that, we got to go back to where we started this whole conversation one last time. We're going to go back to the greatest commandments. So we're going to be looking at that in the book of Luke in the Bible, Luke chapter 10. And this is how it begins. Starting at verse 25, it says, one day, an expert in religious law. So he's a lawyer, right? He's a religious lawyer. That's what he is. He's the expert in religious law. Stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. He says, "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" And that's such a good question. That's like the question we should be asking, right? What does it take to have life after this life? Right? That's like the ultimate question. Jesus, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, doing his Jesus thing, answers a question with a question. He says, well, right, you're the expert. What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? And the man answered, well, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him. Do this, and you will live. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? Right? If you want to inherit eternal life, love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. Good? Cool. All right, let's close in prayer. No, right? Like that doesn't work. What is so funny to me about this conversation is I think oftentimes this tends to be where we want the conversation to end, right? We heard love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. Great, okay? Stop there. And oftentimes the reason that we pause the conversation there is what I know about, every one of us here is that we all want to be known as loving people, right? Like when we think about ourselves, like I'm a loving person, right? You probably believe that about yourself too, right? You're a loving person. And I bet to some degree, everyone here is. We're all loving people, but the problem is we tend to think that we're loving people compared to someone else. Is that we look at someone else and go, well, at least I don't do that. Ooh, I'm more loving than that. And the comparison is wrong, which is why we stop this conversation around love, because if we let Jesus explain what he means by loving God and loving your neighbor, if we let him explain what he means by that, he might actually expose that we're not as loving as we think we are. And that is scary. That's scary. And it points to this reality that I think sometimes what we want is faith without practical. And see, that's exactly what this man wanted, the expert in religious law. And so what does he do, right? It says, the next verse says, the man wanted to justify his actions, or probably more accurately, he wanted to justify his inactions. And so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And here, Jesus tells us a parable about what practical faith looks like. What practical love looks like. What it looks like to love your neighbor in a practical kind of way. And he tells us this parable that is one of the most well-known stories throughout the entire world, and yet, globally, most people don't actually know that this is from the Bible, that this is a teaching that Jesus taught. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this is where Jesus takes us next, to explain what it means to love your neighbor practically, what the Jesus brand of love looks like, what the I can actually say I'm a loving person kind of love looks like, what practical faith, practical love actually looks like. And here is how the parable goes. But before we go there, I need to tell us this about parables too, because this is something that I think sometimes when we read the Bible, we get a little bit confused. A parable is not a real story. Like, this didn't actually happen, okay? Jesus is making this up to make a point, that what a parable is a parable is meant to tell us a truth and perhaps some principles within that truth. The difference between a truth and a parable, right, or a truth and a principle, a truth is something that is true all the time. A principle tends to be true over time. It's not always true, but it tends to be. You see the difference? So what Jesus is going to do is he's going to point out a truth, and he's going to bring us some principles along with that truth. And Jesus tells this parable about the Good Samaritan. He says, a Jewish man traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, or a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. We'll get there. And he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. This is like the perfect opening scene to like a good action movie, right? It says, by chance, a priest came along, right? The pastor came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed over to the other side of the road and passed him by. It says a temple assistant, right, another church staff member, walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Now, right away, we're all kind of thinking the same thing. These two guys, right, the priest and the temple assistant, these are not good people. Like, these are kind of awful human beings, right? What horrible people. They see this man, he's been beaten up, he's been robbed, he's naked, he's half dead, and they just pass him by. Like, you want to know what it means not to love people? Like, that's it, right? That's what it looks like. But to read this part of the parable and to go, well, that's not about me, would actually be to miss the point of what Jesus is trying to say here. That the priest and the temple guy, these are people that they see someone in need, and they cross to the other side of the road so that they don't have to see, hear, or value that guy. And we have to ask the question, I have to ask the question, who do I treat like that? Who is it that I just can't see or hear or value? Who in a very practical way do I cross on the other side of the road so that I can avoid? And who is that for you? I mean, just like to take an honest assessment, right? Maybe that's your kids. Maybe that's your parents. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe it's people who have a different opinion than you do. That you know that you're a stubborn person, you know that, but in that, like, man, it just drives you nuts when somebody disagrees with you and you just can't hear the other person. Maybe for you, it's people who have addictions. That you just can't understand how somebody would treat themselves like that or treat other people like that. Maybe people who have behavioral issues, the way that they talk, the way that they dress, or the way that they look, the way that they behave. Or maybe for you, it's people who have other beliefs, right, who don't believe in Jesus, that when you take a look at your life, there's nobody in your life who doesn't believe in Jesus because you can't understand, you can't see, you can't hear somebody who might believe something different than what you and I believe. We've got to ask the question, right? Who is it that we tend to treat like this? And maybe the better question is not just who is that, but why? Like, what is it in me that causes me not to see, hear, or value that person, those kinds of people? We've got to ask Jesus the question, like, Jesus, would you expose in me, like, what is that? Why is that in me? Because we all have that in us. This man, this religious expert, right? The lawyer, for him, what Jesus was trying to expose in him was that his faith, right? His faith was about knowing the right things, right? Knowing the law, and then doing the bare minimum to fulfill the law. Like, that's what for him, that's what faith was. And so when it came to actually loving people, right, seeing them, hearing them, valuing them, when it came to actually loving people for this lawyer, his love looked a lot more like avoiding than it did loving and connecting with other people. Now, at this point in the parable, I got to imagine, like, as Jesus is trying to tell this story to this man, but there's a crowd around him, I've got to imagine Jesus pauses here and maybe smiles a little bit, like, lets this sink in for a second. And then he goes on and finishes the story. And here's where Jesus brings us to a practical kind of love. Here's what loving your neighbor actually looks like. He says, then a despised Samaritan came along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine. That was like the equivalent of like medicine back then. He soothed his wounds with oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. And if his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time that I'm here." Now, we're going to go back and unpack this just a little bit in a second here, but I want to point out the truth, right? The thing that Jesus is trying to make abundantly clear about what it means to love your neighbor, about what loving your neighbor practically is actually going to require of you. That loving your neighbor, the truth Jesus is trying to get at here, is that love sacrifices. Love sacrifices. Love costs you something for the sake of another person. Loving your neighbor looks a lot like that, practically. It looks a lot like sacrifice. So let's go back. Let's look at some of the parts of this parable again and find the principles of what this looks like, right? We know what the truth is. Let's find the principles of how that actually looks practically. What sacrificial love for your neighbor practically could look like. So let's go back. The first thing I want to show you is that love sacrifices convenience. Love sacrifices convenience. I mean, look at the very first part of this parable. It says, then a despised Samaritan came along. Now, that could be really easily missed, but if you look like at the language that like, hey, he just came along, another way to translate that would be like, hey, as he was going about his everyday routine, right? As he was just on his commute to work, as he was just wandering through the grocery store, right? As he was just doing what he did every day, as he was just doing his regular thing, he happened to come along a person. He was interrupted. Who here loves interruptions? Aren't they great? They're the worst. Interruptions are awful. I am like a type A kind of person. I make a plan. I like to stick to my plan. And when that gets interrupted, I get so irritated. Anyone like me here? Yeah. It is so frustrating to me. I get so irritated when like I get interrupted in what I'm about to do. But what I've learned is that oftentimes interruptions are promptings from God. You ever recognize that? You ever try to sleep in the morning only to have the neighbor kid like ring the doorbell because they missed the bus and now they need a ride to school? I have. Right? Interruptions are awful. You ever try to save money for something, right? You're trying to buy a new car, you're trying to save up for a trip, and then the Lord kind of nudges you and goes, hey, actually I want you to use that to pay for your coworker's rent for the next couple months. Isn't that frustrating? Isn't it irritating? But sometimes what love requires you to do is sacrifice convenience for the sake of another person. So can we make that practical? Don't ignore interruptions. Okay, now here's the deal. From here on out, like this whole message, from here on out, you need to be asking the question, all right, Jesus, how do you want me to respond? Because there's 1,000 ways to respond, okay? I'm going to give you a couple, but you need to actually process with the Lord. What does this mean for you? You can't do everything all at once. That's not real, okay? But for you, practically, what is the Lord saying to you? How does he want you to respond? Perhaps it's don't ignore interruptions. Right? From now to the new year, pay attention to those interruptions in your life, the things that cause you to break out of your everyday routine because somebody needs something. Because you recognize another person. You see them and you hear them, and you know the Lord is calling you to value them. Right? Don't ignore interruptions. For me, I've shared this with you guys a couple times in the past, but the last year and a half has been the hardest season of my life. Loss, grief, transition. I mean, there's just been a lot of heartbreak in my life over the last number of months. And what I've recognized in this season is the number of people who have happily interrupted their own lives for me. People who've called me just to check in and see how I'm doing. People who text me almost every day and say, hey, I'm praying for you this morning. How you doing, man? People who will call me up and say, hey, I'm bringing you food. Do you want this or this? Right? Not hey, would you like a meal? But I'm bringing you something that just completely inconvenience themselves for me, that interrupt their own lives for me. I had a buddy who lives across the country out in California who flew all the way here just to spend the day with me. I can't tell you how much that has meant to me and continues to mean to me, that people would choose to interrupt their own lives, would choose to inconvenience themselves for me. It means the world to me that I understand God's love more than I have ever known before because of the people in my life who've chosen to do this for me. But that's what love does, isn't it? Sometimes love calls you to sacrifice convenience for the sake of another person. Love sacrifices convenience, but love can also sacrifice comfort. And us Americans, we love our comfort, don't we? Love sacrifices comfort. I mean, look at the parable again here. It says, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. This was different than what the priest felt and what the temple assistant felt, right? He felt compassion. That when you feel pity for somebody, like you can feel a certain way, but it doesn't move you to any kind of response. Compassion will always call you to respond. When this man felt compassion, it didn't just sit inside. It had to be expressed, right? Because that's what love does. It expresses itself. And how did this man move? How did the Samaritan, how did his compassion move him forward? What did it call him to sacrifice? Well, what does he do? He gets into this uncomfortable situation with this man. A complete stranger, naked on the side of the road. Just sit in that for a second. A naked person on the side of the road. He's beaten up. He's half dead. The Samaritan doesn't know the story, right? He just sees this guy. And he chooses to step into the situation, right? He gives him some medicine. He bandages his wounds. And then what does he do? He loads him up and he gives him a ride to the hospital, right, to the inn. He spends the day, he spends the night with this total stranger. That being uncomfortable didn't stop the Samaritan from doing what was loving, right? From loving his neighbor. Because love needs to be practical. Faith is practical. It calls you into practical action, into practical motion. That sometimes what love requires of you is to sacrifice comfort and to step into what is uncomfortable. So for you and for me, who does your discomfort keep you from loving? That's a hard question. I'll expose myself here of how this discomfort keeps me from loving people in a second, but with a practical response I'm going to give to you that I've been trying to do myself is to lean into discomfort. When you feel that like uncomfortable, like feeling around someone, or what, like just pause and like, Lord, what is that? And perhaps that's something that you need to step into. For me, what I've learned about myself is that I am an embarrassingly socially awkward person around new people. It is what it is. I mean, sometimes I can stand up here and like you can feel the awkward sometimes. But when we meet like face to face and I'm meeting new people, I can get just weird and I don't know what it is. I'm not trying to be weird. I just get weird. I get socially awkward and it tends to be around adults more than it is around like, teens or college age, like middle schoolers, like even, anything in that kind of range. Because listen, if that's you, you're just as awkward as I am. So like we get along just fine. That's great. But adults, you all seem to just be so together. And it's scary, it's intimidating, and I don't like it. And so I get all awkward and weird around people. When I became a parent, like my wife and I, we knew we were going to have kids, and so we took classes, we read books, and like we're getting all prepared for having a kid. But what we never learned about having kids is that someday your kids are going to make friends, and then you're going to need to meet their parents. Yeah, I didn't know that. And so 9 years now I've been having to meet new parents over and over again, and I've been super uncomfortable with it. And everything in me has wanted to just be like the keeps to himself parent, right? Oh yeah, we're at the sporting event. Yeah, that's hey, we know that's Brian, but like we don't know anything about it. Like that's who I want to be because I am so uncomfortable around meeting new people. But that's not what the Lord has called me to do. The Lord's called me to actually see and hear and value my kids' friends' parents. And so I've had to step into that space. And here's a little glimpse into my life of just how awkward I am. Every time that I know that I'm going to have to meet a new parent, I will open up my phone and Google search good questions to ask new people. The number of times I have searched that same thing it's embarrassing. But I know that like if you want to meet people, you've got to ask good questions, okay? Otherwise, I'm going to just be talking about myself the whole time, or I'm just going to be the guy going with nothing to say. And that's weird too. Like you have to ask good questions. So I Google search how to ask good questions to new people, and so I'll ask questions. Sometimes it goes really well. Sometimes it just crashes and burns, and I look like an idiot. But what I've learned over time is like, listen, I'm no less uncomfortable around new people. Like I'm still equally as uncomfortable. But I've learned that I can lean into the discomfort, and I've become more comfortable being uncomfortable. And as I've done this now for almost a decade with new parents, my capacity to love new people has grown like crazy. New people, new kinds of people. That God is working in me and He is expanding my capacity to love. And I've learned that love sacrifices comfort for the sake of another person. What might that look like for you? Who does your discomfort keep you from loving? Another thing is that love sacrifices, this is a hard one, love sacrifices possessions. Your stuff, Love sacrifices our stuff, right? Here, we go back to the parable again, right? And what did he do? He handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, right? And he said, well, and also, if the bill goes higher, I'll pay for that too, right? That the Samaritan, he sacrifices his possessions, his stuff. The equivalent of 2 silver coins in like today's world is about $100. And that's where his giving started, for an absolute stranger. But love can call you to sacrifice your stuff, your possessions. Now, one of the things that I do, that Brendan does, that Sharon does, Mark does, like when people come up here to like give a message, one of the practices we have is like, hey, we're not going to just tell you stuff to do that like we won't do ourselves. And so as I'm preparing for this message, I get to this part and I'm like, okay, Lord, sacrifices possessions. And I ask the question, okay, well, Lord, what am I willing to sacrifice? What of my stuff am I willing to sacrifice? And vice versa, what of my stuff am I not willing to sacrifice? And as I just spent some time processing with this is how the list kind of went. Like, all right, Lord, would I be willing to sacrifice my shoes? Yeah, absolutely. I could give away my shoes to somebody, no problem. Don't ask for my shoes. The Lord did not say yes to you. So just don't ask me for my shoes. I'm just kidding. Maybe he will. I don't know. But I could give away my shoes, no problem. That would not be an issue at all. I could do that. Money, just like cash. It's weird. Over the last couple like seasons of my life, that's easy for me. I can give away money. That's no problem. I can love somebody by giving up my stuff, my cash. That's easy. My van, my vehicle. That was a harder one. I was like, maybe. Lord, if you called me to give my van to someone, I think I could do that. I'd have to have a conversation with Abby, don't get me wrong, but I think I could give up my van. But the one that got me was my phone. Isn't that embarrassing? I was like, I don't think I could give up my phone. If the Lord called me to give my phone to someone, I don't know that I could do that. And that makes no sense. Like, a van is way more than a phone, right? But there's something in me that was like, I can't give up my phone. Why? And I'm in this process now of like, Lord, what is that in me that I won't give up my phone for the sake of somebody, that I'm unwilling to sacrifice my phone? Like, what is that? And right off the bat, one of the things the Lord, spoke to me was, yeah, Brian, that's because you don't own your phone owns you. I was like, dang it. But I got to ask the question, what of your stuff owns you? Maybe for you, it's your phone too, right? Especially like, teenagers, if you've got Snapchat, right? Maybe it's your Snap streak. You got to keep the streak alive, and you feel like you're going to just collapse if you let that go. What is that in you? Maybe for you, the thing that you would never give up is your shoes. Maybe that's for you. That's what it is. Maybe it's your sports memorabilia collection. Or but bring that to the Lord. Like, Lord, what am I unwilling to give up for someone else? What of my stuff owns me? A practical response to this, give it away. Now, when I say, yeah, just give it away, what I'm not saying is like, man, just take all your stuff and like, just give it away to everybody. That's great. No. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, ask the question, Lord, here's my stuff. How do you want me to respond? What do you want with this? You see, sometimes the Lord gives you something as just a blessing for you, and it's yours. Sometimes he gives you things to just be blessed by it for a season, and then he says, now it's time to hand it off, to give the blessing to someone else. And other times the Lord gives you something to just hold for a second, to just hold for a moment. And you get to be the middle person between him and the blessing he wants to give to someone else. But can we sit in that tension? Can we bring our stuff to the Lord and say, okay, God, here's what I got. Are you calling me to sacrifice? Sacrifice my possessions, my stuff. Now for me, this is a journey that I've been on for almost a decade. I've been trying to be really intentional about this because I've known how much my stuff has gotten a hold on me in the past. And so I've become way more comfortable giving actual possessions to people. Because there's something about like a tangible like thing that you can have in your hands that can speak to your heart and speaks to people's heart to let them know that they are loved by God in ways that maybe even just an encouraging word would never get to. Now, I'm not perfect at this by any stretch, hence the phone thing, but I'm growing in this. And again, my capacity is growing. And what I've learned in this one in particular is that when it comes to loving other people, like by sacrificing for other people, sacrifice by definition is losing something of yourself for the sake of another person, right? It's a loss, right? You're giving something to another person. You're losing something. But what I've learned about sacrificial love is that it never ends in a loss. That although I have lost possessions, what I have gained that I would never have expected is this unbelievable freedom that I have in my life that I've never had before until this season. I have this freedom that I'm not bound to my stuff anymore. I can give away encouragement and, yeah, I might feel awkward, but so what? The sacrificial love doesn't end in a loss. But we've got to ask the question, Lord, what are you calling me to sacrifice? How do you want me to love another person? What does that look like for me? And Jesus, he wraps up this he tells the parable, and then this is kind of how it finishes. He says, now which of these three, right, the priest, the temple assistant, or the Samaritan, now which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? And the man replied, well, the one who showed mercy to him. Yeah. Now go and do the same. That's Jesus' response. Now go and do the same. Make your faith practical. You see, as I look at this story, the expert in religious law, right, the lawyer, when he heard about the wounded man was just a subject to be discussed. It's all that this story was to the lawyer. It's all who that man was to the lawyer, just someone to be talked about. To the bandits in the story, the wounded man was just someone to use and exploit. Right? What can I get from them? To the religious guys in the story, the wounded man was a problem to be avoided. I've got better things to do. I've got holier things to do. I got to get to church, right? Here's a different one. To the innkeeper, the wounded man was just a customer to serve for a fee. But to the Samaritan, the wounded man was a human being worthy of love and care, worthy to be seen, heard, and valued. Now, for each of us, no matter which one of these characters maybe you most kind of identify with in the moment, to Jesus, every one of these characters and every one of you are someone that he said was worth dying for. That's the beauty of the gospel. That's the beauty of Jesus. That's what practical faith, what practical love calls itself to. Sacrificing of yourself for the sake of another. Regardless of who they are or what they might think or believe or whatever, that's someone that Jesus said is worth dying for because he wanted to connect with you and wants you to connect with him. And that's what this is all about. Jesus, he sacrificed his convenience, right? I mean, how many times throughout the Gospels does Jesus welcome interruptions? He's on his way to somewhere, but he welcomes an interruption by a sick person, by a hurting person, by a religious person, by a shunned person. Jesus is constantly welcoming interruptions because love sacrifices convenience. Jesus sacrificed his comfort. How many times does Jesus have meals with people who are ashamed or disgraced by their community, by their peers? And Jesus, as uncomfortable as it probably felt for him to maybe have a meal with this person, it was worth it to him. Because even they were someone worthy of being seen, heard, and valued. Jesus sacrificed his possessions. I mean, from the very get-go, what is it? Jesus comes from heaven and is born into a poor family. Jesus, he multiplies food and just gives it all away. Because that's what love does. It sacrifices for the sake of another person. And ultimately, what does Jesus do? He sacrifices his life for the sake of humanity, so that he might have connection with us and that we might have connection with him. That's the beauty of Christmas, isn't it? I mean, it's not just celebrating that a baby, right? Jesus came into the world, God came into the world. Like, that's awesome, that's great. But there's hope that is so much bigger than that. It's not just that Jesus came, but it's everything that that meant. The sacrifice that Jesus would step into. That's why we celebrate Christmas, that sacrificial love, it gives birth to life, right? It doesn't end at a loss. The sacrificial love, it creates a freedom for our future. And sacrificial love, it expands our capacity for connection. Connection with Him, connection with each other, and even connection with ourselves. And that's who Jesus is, and that's what He came to give to you and to me. It's connection. A practical kind of faith that leads to a practical kind of love that will ultimately lead to greater and deeper connection with one another. So as we close the series, as we close our conversation, as we prepare for Christmas in a couple days, I want to just leave you with this kind of final thought, is that for you, if you find yourself more in the, faith without practical camp, and this morning I simply want to extend the invitation. Ask that second question. Lord, I have this deep faith. I believe that you're real. I believe you came and died for me. I believe all the things, but Lord, help me to respond. What does that look like for me now? What are you calling me to next? And if you find yourself more in the other camp, the practical without faith, that the Jesus thing has maybe kind of been a little bit like, it's a bit much, but I want to be a loving person. I want to do better. I want to be better. Then this morning, I want to extend the faith invitation to you. This morning, would you give your life to Jesus? Would you take a step of faith and say, Jesus, speak to me. Whatever you want to do it in me today. This morning, if that's you, if you want to say yes to following Jesus, maybe for the first time or maybe for the first time in a long time, I want to say a prayer with you and a prayer for you. And at the end of the service, I want to invite you, would you share that with someone? You could find myself, Pastor Brendan, you've got a prayer team in the back. If you came with somebody, share that with them. But share the step that you're going to take this morning with another person. Because we want to celebrate that with each other. We want to pray for each other. We want to cheer each other on in this journey of practical love, of practical faith, of being connected with God, with each other, and ourselves. Can we pray together? Jesus, I thank you so much for the way that you love. That you didn't just think about loving us. You got your hands dirty. You came to this earth, born in a manger. You lived a kind of life that we could never live so that we could have a connection with you that we could have never otherwise had. Jesus, this morning we say, I give you my life. That we're going to have all kinds of other conversations, Lord, but this morning it's simply that. Jesus, I give you my life. What do you want to say to me? And how do you want me to respond? Jesus, we want to be more connected with you. We want to learn what sacrificial love looks like so that we can be more connected with the people around us. And as we do that, Lord, would we learn more about the truth of who we are so that we would be connected to ourselves in a way that allows us to love more freely and more wholly and to look more like you, to become more like you, Jesus. We thank you for the hope that you give. We thank you for the love that you give. We thank you for your willingness to sacrifice everything for each and every one of us. Lord, we're yours. Amen.